Hello, bookworms. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where we talk about your favorite books. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and today I'm so pleased to talk to Aime Austin. Aime is the author of the Casey Court crime fiction series. Casey is always in trouble, and Aime's full-time job is to rescue her. Fortunately, Aime's got experience. She practiced family and criminal law in Cleveland, Ohio for several years. When Aime isn't rescuing Casey from herself, she's hosting the podcast A Time to Thrill, raising her son, or traveling between Budapest and Los Angeles. This is one of those episodes where the conversation changed my entire perception of the book. The second I finished talking to Aime, I started reading it again. I know you're going to love hearing her tell me why What Happened Before He Shot Her by Elizabeth George is the best book ever. Whether they read a book a day or a book a year, I love asking people to tell me about their favorite books. And that includes you, dear listener. What's your all-time favorite? Your desert island classic? What about the childhood favorite that you still know by heart? The mystery that took you by surprise? The biography that changed your way of thinking? Or the book club favorite that you can't stop thinking about? I'm looking for guests from all walks of life to talk to me about all kinds of books here on the show. Go to my website, juliewroteabook.com, and click on the button that says, Be a Guest on the Best Book Ever. I'm really looking forward to talking to you. Now, back to the show. Hi, Aime. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I love to talk about books.
Oh, it's my favorite thing to talk about. So good, we're here for the day. Your bio says that your previous job as a family and criminal lawyer,
Yeah.
I can see that how that affects your writing life as a crime novelist, but does it change how you read? Do you lean toward reading, murdery things?
Oh, I'm really bad at having a preference. I mean, when I've gone to reader events as an author, I'm always so surprised that people I only read Regency historical. And I'm like, wow, okay. And they're like, what do you read? I'm like, whatever comes in the door. Literally, I have no discernment. So whatever, somebody just sent me a book and I'm like, okay, I'll read it. I read whatever. I read Riley. I don't read sci-fi and I don't read fantasy. I have read them, but they're not a thing that I read. So it's probably split between crime fiction, romance, women's fiction. I love women's fiction. And I don't read literary fiction as much as I used to. So that, and then I also heavily read nonfiction. So about 50% of what I read is nonfiction as well.
Do you not read literary fiction intentionally, or you just haven't gotten around to it lately?
Oh, I think it's intentional because I think the older I get, the more I enjoy genre fiction and I enjoy a plot. So the last time I read literary fiction, was it Barbara Kingsolver? I can't even remember. The Secret Life of Bees, something. It's been a while. And I thought this writing is lyrical and the words are beautiful. And I love all there is about the writing, but what I really want is a plot. I really want something to happen. And with some literary fiction, I'm not saying that's true of all, that is not there. And I want a very plot-driven book or character-driven or emotion-driven. And so I'm looking for a certain experience now in reading to be transported into somebody's, to be honest, kind of crazy world that I don't exist in. Well, because I can't, I'm not going to have all this drama and there's no murders in my life. It can't be that crazy. And so I can't, I can't live that way, but I want to experience that. It's oh, he had an affair and I get all angry and I can't believe it. You're not going to dump him. He has a second wife. Did you know he has a second wife? It's just the outrage, or I can't believe your boss is treating you that way. All you're trying to do is your job. And so all of that I enjoy. But I do enjoy it in crime fiction as well. Although I mainly read police procedurals versus reading, I guess, legal thrillers. And I'm more interested in frankly, the psychological machinations of figuring out why a person would commit that kind of crime. So I don't read serial killer novels or psychopaths, sociopaths, because they don't have a good reason, because they're just sociopathic or psychopathic. So I'm more interested in somebody who's you injured me 30 years ago, and now I'm exacting this revenge or whatever it is. I sort of I want to know why they did the thing they did. That's so fascinating to me.
Now, do you get, given your background, do you get hung up on the technical details? Because I don't have any, legal or crime background, so I can read this and go, oh, okay, he solved a murder in 10 minutes. Yeah, sure, that sounds right.
Except for in TV, yes, because TV can't be pacing can't work that way. However, in books, no. So I only read authors who are fairly accurate in their descriptions. Because that's important to me. So no offense to like Agatha Christie, but I don't do, I don't know, the house murders where, we're all sitting around and then, we come to the determination. I need something more where they have to go out and they have to meet people and the drug dealer gave them this little bit of information and, that kind of thing I really enjoy.
Well, my next question is how you came to this book that we're discussing today, but that makes it all click into place about why you must love Elizabeth George, because she's really known for this, right? Is the real detail into character.
Yes. And so I adore her and writers like her. So I want to know why. I want interplay between the characters, especially if you're going to read a long series. I don't read series like that where the people don't age and, there's no progression in character. So it's really important we have character progression and then the interrelationship between characters is like 50% of the story. And then the other 50% is them going out to catch this killer or rapist or whatever the crime is as well.
Well, first, how did you first come across Elizabeth George?
Okay, so I lived in Los Angeles about 20 years. I've only lived in 3 places. I don't move that often. But the second library, there's something called Memorial Library, which is, I don't know, like on Olympic in Mid-City. Either that or the Studio City Library. So I've known all the librarians because I'm that person. But, they then, like, at some point, they curate a certain style or they have a certain curation. And I gravitate towards librarians that curate the way I like. So like Emily Aronson, who's the librarian at Studio City now, and even the previous one, curate those kinds of books. And so, there's 50 branches in Los Angeles. So each one is not huge. So I go to the branches that curate what I like. So I went to one branch and she was like, that was closer to my first house. And she was like, no, you got to go to the Memorial branch because that librarian, whom I don't remember, I feel horrible, curates the kinds of books that you would like. And she was right. And I was like, okay, thank you. So I think I came across Elizabeth George either in Memorial or at the Studio City branch. They had it they don't have large crime sections because each branch is, fairly small. And I think that was in there. And I picked up the first book. And people's first book's not quite the same. So it was shorter because, your first book has to be shorter to be published. But there was something about it. So I just kept reading on. And she only publishes a book every 2 or 3 years. So it's not as if it's a huge amount of time. But the new one would come out and I would get it. And I really, really love her development as a writer. The books have gotten longer, but the nuanced character development is much better than in the beginning.
So this book that we're discussing today, What Came Before He Shot Her, is 14 in this series. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, I have never read any Elizabeth George before. And as I was going through all of the reviews and things, a lot of people dislike this particular one because they didn't feel it fit in with the rest of the series. And that was a complaint I saw several times is all these characters we've really grown to love and know so well don't show up too much because this other family, it's all about this other family.
Right.
Was that your impression of it as well?
No. So I love this. So originally, when we talked about doing the podcast, I didn't realize the book was 15 years old. Like apparently a lot of time has passed in my life, but because to me, it was like, it feels like day before yesterday, but I do remember when it came out, it was not even listed within the series. So it was sort of marketed as a one-off. And there are certain authors, I'll read anything they write, no matter the genre, it doesn't matter. And she's one of them. So I picked it up. And when I realized what it was about, I don't know how, I think I didn't realize what it was about until the end of the book. Because I don't read back cover copy because it's often too spoilerish and I don't do spoilers. So I want to open every book and have a completely immersive experience without knowing anything about it.
Okay.
So when I picked it up and I was like, okay, so she wrote a new book and the title is kind of intriguing. And I read the whole thing, and only at the end of the book do you realize that how it fits in. So at that time, it wasn't listed as a series book. And I was surprised when I looked it up recently on Goodreads to see that it was, as well as probably Amazon. But also, it was, so when I saw the reviews, like the reviews now are actually better than they were. It was like 1 star, like everywhere. People just hated it because they had, I feels like the other thing I was saying, they had a very narrow expectation and they wanted her as an author to stay in that lane. And I thought it was a brilliant and beautiful exploration of another aspect of the world, and also an opportunity to have other characters, because, even with the evolution of characters across, I don't know, over to 25 books, there's some limitations. Like Barbara's always Barbara and Thomas is always Thomas and Winston's always Winston, and Deborah and all these other characters. And it was great for her to be able to tell the story of somebody else.
Can you describe what this book is about and maybe could you also describe what the series that we're talking about is for our listeners who maybe haven't come across Elizabeth George?
Yeah, so I'll start with the series. So the series is basically, okay, oh God, I have such a feeling about this. It is billed, okay, so because it is billed as the Thomas Lynley series. And I don't think I knew that originally, because when books, when you read the first or second book, the series hasn't been built yet and hasn't been marketed a certain way. Mm-hmm. So it was not marketed that way. And to me, the great protagonist of all the books is Barbara Havers, who's the partner of Thomas Lynley. So Thomas Lynley is an earl. He's the 8th Earl of Asherton. He drives a Bentley, he lives in Belgravia, he's wealthy, but he also decided to work, and not be a leisure class. He decided to work in London, and he works for New Scotland Yard as a detective. Well, his ranks change, but let's just say detective inspector. And so he has this partner, Barbara Havers, who is not wealthy. She sort of lives in she lives in somebody's back house, to be honest. It's really tiny. She's very dowdy. She's supposed to be very unattractive and does not dress well. So it's this rich man who, has decided to step out into, police work, and his partner, and then some of the ancillary people around in her life as well as his. So they're basically murder mysteries. Like people die at boarding school, all these different places. And because of England's structure, they can, travel outside of London, as opposed to like our state or city or county structure. And they solve these cases. And that's what the series is. People die, they solve the cases. But as the series has evolved, the books have gotten longer, but there's also been more social commentary. So by the time we get to this book, which I think you said was 14, which may be about right. In the previous book, I'm going to have the spoiler because otherwise it makes no sense. In the previous book, the 8th Earl of Asherton, Thomas Lynley, gets married and his wife is pregnant. It's all very happily ever after, and she's beautiful and they're beautiful, and they have all this money and they go shopping and everything is lovely. And she gets shot randomly, and the readers were upset. And I was like, I'm not that upset. Like something has to happen. Like it's 14 books, like things have to progress. And interestingly, she wrote an essay. So I was looking on her website because when this book came out, there was a lot of silence around it. But she wrote an essay like several years later explaining that she wanted to do this as an artist. She wanted to do this and she didn't want to remain stagnant. And I so appreciate that idea. So all that said, what came before he shot her becomes sort of this twin book to the previous one, which I was with No One as Witness, I believe, to the previous book, where then, so at the end of the previous book, let's say book 13, the Helen Lynley gets shot. She was Helen Clive before, but she changed her name, gets shot in front of her house, right after she's shopping for maternity clothes or baby stuff. And then in the next book, we just start back in time, let's say 6 months or 9 months or whatever number of months it is, with this family story. And at the end of obviously this book, she's shot again, but then why, because, it was a random crime and you have no idea, like, was she targeted because he's in Scotland Yard? Were they targeted because they're rich? Was he targeted for any number of reasons, And so you sort of get that. So this book ends up being just sort of I would call it like a meditation on, how can I say this? The results of poverty, trauma, sex abuse, like any number of things that you come across. So let me say this. When I was practicing law, So I did both juvenile and adult crimes. So you'd be, or even juvenile abuse and neglect cases. So you'd be in these courts and they're like, we have to take these children away. Their parents are abusive or neglectful, or they just can't handle raising these children. And we're going to put them in foster care and we're going to therefore solve all these problems. And then I would walk down the street and go to adult court where they'd have like a pre-sentencing hearing where they discuss, what the sentence should be in concert with Department of Probation. And they would stand there and say, well, this child was in foster care their whole life. What do you expect? So I watched that dichotomy for years and it drove me crazy. But I think, so the reason this book I think probably spoke to me is because she discusses those things. Like everybody's like, well, they're poor and, they should there's a lot of responsibility placed on poverty or trauma, and you should just fix it. And sometimes it's not fixable, especially by children. And I think I really like that she addresses in this book, all of these things can be like a confluence of events that end up with something horrible happening at the end.
I only made it 100 pages into this book for several reasons. The first one being, it was so not a typical murder book structure. And it felt like this giant descent into the pit of hell for these poor, beautiful babies, these three babies. And I kept thinking like, I thought it was going to work the way murder mysteries generally work. Where we have the dead body in the first chapter and then we spend the rest of it learning and then figuring it out. And so then it just started with these sad children and their lives just kept getting sadder. This was going to be one of my first questions is, can you convince me to keep reading this? And I feel already like I should keep reading because this is going to go in a different way than I was expecting it to go.
Okay. So publishing has changed a lot in the last 15 years. It's changed a lot, so much in my life. So I was sort of hungry, and I don't know if I'm still, but any person who talked about people of color was something I wanted to read because it was so rare. And so I was like, I will put up with anything. God save us all. I will put up with anything to get a different kind of story. And I'm not saying all Black people live in poverty and, are on the verge of, crime or anything like that. But I just wanted something different. I mean, because, her main character is an Earl. I mean, who's like, who deigns to work as a, a police officer. And that's a lot of tension about that. And the English aristocracy and his friends versus like, the friends of the people he works with. And while that's interesting, it's interesting, but it's not my world, which is fine. But it was so, I used to be so hungry for stories that were just about something different. So when I finished the book, I have some issues with the dialect. I don't like reading dialect, and British dialect is its own thing, but it's easier to read than to listen to. That's one thing. But I do think I don't need a happy ending. So and this does not have a happy ending, but I just like the realism of this downward spiral. I don't know what I'm saying. That sounds awful, but people spiral downward, but there's not that many stories of that. Usually those stories are on the other end. So you meet them when they're at the bottom and it's the rebirth, the phoenix rising from the ashes, those kinds of tales. And I just sort of like the spiral down because bad things happen to people and it goes badly. I mean, I used to visit, people in prison, and that's where, and you hear the whole story and you go, oh, it started not great. And here you are in prison.
It's so interesting to hear someone who is a fan of this series and so passionate about the series talking about it. I do think this book is not done a service by the cover copy and by where it's placed, on the Amazon page, because it's very much set there as book number, whatever it is, 14 or 15 in the Inspector Lynley series. Right. And so I automatically thought, oh, this is going to be, like the Inspector Gamache series or like the Agatha Christie series, these other books that I have read. And I was going, that's not what this is at all. This is sort of like a socio-political examination of this one poor family.
Yes.
I didn't even get to the mystery because I got so sad and depressed, and I couldn't bear it reading any more about that baby, the youngest one. My heart was just
that's so interesting.
Daughter,
my God, not a mystery. Yeah, so it's not a mystery. And I don't think I never said that, right? So I'm like, I didn't sell it as a mystery.
No,
No. But it's just I hear what you're saying, but when I read it, it was not, it was sort of, Tana French and
I
how she has
do.
like the Dublin Murder Squad, but then she has the two standalone books like The Witch Elm and The Searcher.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people have the same sort of reaction. I mean, those aren't mysteries, so I'm not saying that, but they have a similar reaction, but they are more sociopolitical. And so people are like, well, I just like the Dublin Murder Squad. And I like the fact that she has these like, detectives in Dublin and each one is a different detective and they solve this murder. And now we're out with Cal in like, like the hinterlands and he's like hiking up the side of the hill. And I hear that, but I like the writer, I think, more than the other part is necessary for me. I always want to know more. And no offense to Lynley and his friends, but there's some limitations to them sitting around, contemplating, the tension between the aristocracy and average citizens.
Okay, I think what I need to do, I clearly need to start from the beginning, don't I?
Oh God, but it's, that's a lifetime. That's an investment and they get longer. I mean, I'm not kidding you. The last two books, I swear to God, were 700-800 pages. And, let me say this. I have my moments where I think New York books of writers who are well-established are not as heavily edited as they perhaps could be.
Yeah.
But they do get expansive, but it's very interesting. So the first, I don't know, let's say 5 books are not nearly as nuanced as later. I don't know. So this is always the tension in publishing. I don't know. It's because she's successful that she has a bigger hand, or because she just evolved as a writer. But I really like her discussion of socioeconomics, politics, religion, and race is much broader in the later books than it was in the earlier ones.
So when you are recommending books to people, will you say this one? What Came Before You Shot Her? Or do you generally tell people if you're going to start with Elizabeth George, start with book 1?
No, I never thought about it. So when you asked me about this podcast, it's the book I recommend to everyone. Readers. I have readers email me all the time because I like to talk about books. So they'll email me and they're like, what do you recommend? And this is always the first book I recommend. And I hadn't thought about it, but they're my readers. So I assume that if I'm writing about sex trafficking and what horrible things happen to these people, then they're prepared for that. But I had never thought about
it.
So I've been recommending it. When I looked it up and I realized I've been recommending the same book for 15 years, I was like, wow, I guess I'm really all in. So no, I never recommend it. I give no context because I don't like context. So I recommend this. I sometimes recommend Tana French. I recommend Julia Spencer Fleming. Yes. Yeah.
So is that the most recent book you've read?
No. So I'm going to be honest. Like, how can I say this? So I'm in this, I go through self-help modes, although the last one was probably 20 years ago. So maybe they don't last that long. No, the last book I actually read was like, I don't know, like adult children of emotionally stunted parents or something like that, which is actually fascinating because I'm in this space in my life where I feel like to some degree people are a black box. And I used to be very good at reading people, but I feel like at some point lately, like some people, I'm just like, I don't understand what's going on. I'm lifting the lid and it's just dark in there. And so I've been reading all these books trying to get a better read on people because I guess as I'm getting older, I'm meeting more people. And so I'm meeting more people. I'm just like, I don't understand. Like I met somebody recently and then I read this whole book about when he's married to mom, about mother enmeshed men, because I'd never come across it before. And I was like, I know, but I met somebody and I was like, oh, there's a lot of issues here. And then I read the book and I was like, oh, this explains it. But I had never met anybody. Like I've lived a whole lot of years and I'd never met anybody like that. And so there's been a lot of that. And then I'm reading crime fiction. I have not been reading romance, which has been like a staple my whole life. But right now I'm in the middle. Oh no, I'm at the end of a divorce. Let me say that. I'm in this space where that's not working for me. The happy endings were not the reason I read it. I read it mainly for that falling in love piece, like that piece where two people like recognize what they can be for each other. That part I really like. But that has to be, so with romance, I don't want to say in particular, because I've read like thousands of them over the years. But as I've gotten older, I'm a little more particular and I'm looking more for that relationship and less for humor or hijinks or meet cute. So it's been a little more difficult to find that. I mean, I have my authors like Serena Bowen, I think does that well. There's a woman, Sarah Mayberry does that so well. Like I think she's brilliant at it. So there's some authors I know who are absolutely brilliant at that and I would read them, but finding that generally is a little more difficult.
What prompted you to start your podcast? Will you tell us a little bit about that?
They have a podcast called The Time to Thrill, and it's just sort of conversations with creative women. And I don't know, like, I think, so, it's a pandemic. I started 3 books. I'm usually a person who writes a book from start to finish. I never work on multiple projects. I'm very disciplined and structured. But in 2020, like I just couldn't pull it together. And, my child was home all day, every day. So I'm sure that didn't help with the concentration piece. But I started thinking about some of the things I really enjoy in my life. And one of the things I enjoy in my life most is talking to creative women sort of about their process and sort of their life. And I have these conversations regularly, like in my life. And also when I used to travel to writers' conferences. And I thought I want to share those conversations with other people. And that was the prompting for it. And it's been like the biggest joy of my life. Like I've gotten to have like deeper conversations with people than I would necessarily have. I mean, I think I know all of them personally. But you have like a conversation and then you like talk about food and you talk about your kids and it's sort of like far ranging, especially some of these people I've known like 20 years. Yeah. But I sort of love the opportunity to have like a focused and directed conversations just about their creativity. So one of the people I interviewed, is a woman named Elizabeth Decker. So she's a painter. I met her oddly in a writing class years and years ago. I think she said 16 years ago. And so I've known her for 16 years. I mean, so I've known her a long time, but it was the first time I ever talked to her about her art. Like I didn't know that she was untutored or I didn't know why she painted the things that she did. Like I had never had those in-depth conversations about her creativity, and that I've always wanted to have those conversations, and sometimes I'll have them over wine. And now I get to like ask them all the questions I've always wanted to know about their art and their creative process.
You're a person who is so interested in creative expression. I'm curious if you ever see yourself venturing into other genres in your writing life.
This is so interesting. I just had this conversation last night with a friend, and she was like, what is the bigger story that you want to tell? And I thought that is an interesting, I know. And then I had to go to bed.
That's a hard one.
That was it was a hard one. And it was such an interesting question because I would have said last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, no, I'll write crime fiction and I'll write romance. I'm not writing romance right now, but that's probably a function of my personal life. So, when I'll write these 2 things and that'll just be how it rolls. And I think that I'm thinking now, especially since I'm ending a series and starting a new one, but the new one's maybe only going to be a trilogy. So it's not, I'm not 10 books into a new thing, but I do think there may be a different story to tell. And that's something I'm thinking deeply about. So I don't know if you saw the movie Promising Young Woman, but it's one of the front page of Variety, let's say like 6 weeks ago. I don't know. Time is fluid right now. They had the script. And they sometimes have scripts. And I normally don't read them. I'm going to be honest, but I was probably procrastinating. So one morning I was like, oh, well, I clicked on it. And like 2 hours later, I looked up and I thought, oh, if all scripts were this evocative, I understand more about like the beauty of screenwriting and the whole writer-director thing. But it was such a different story. And I was like, oh, there are different stories to tell outside of any particular genre convention. And I wonder if I want to do that. So it's something I'm playing around with in my head because I don't know what's next. I mean, I have like 2 or 3 books on deck, but after that, I don't know.
Well, I cannot wait to see what you do.
Neither can I, because it's going to be a surprise.
Aime, this has been so fun talking to you. I hope you will come back anytime you have a book you want to talk to me about, because it is a delight. Will you share with my listeners where they can find you?
So I am, ironically, not that many places on social media. I try to cut back because it sucks up my time. But I am on Instagram at ThrillerPod, and on Facebook it's just the Casey Court series. I don't post on Facebook that often, probably not that often at all. But I do post on Instagram fairly often. I spend a lot of time thinking about what my characters say, and then also like excerpts from the podcast that I love. Like especially there's one actually from Evelyn Adams where she talks about romance being seen in romance. And I never thought about it that way. And I thought it was like one of the most brilliant things anybody's ever said.
And that your Instagram is also called ThrillerPod?
Yes.
Okay, super. I want to thank you for joining me today. This has been so fun talking to you.
No, thank you so much. I love books so much.
Thanks for listening, bookworms. For more information on this episode and links to all the books we discussed, go to our website, bestbookeverpodcast.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at bestbookeverpodcast. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and you can find me everywhere as Julie Wrote a Book. Remember, whenever you are book shopping, help support indie bookstores and this podcast by using my affiliate link at bookshop.org/bestbookever. Bookshop's mission is to support local independent bookstores, and if you shop using my link, I'll get a small percentage of your purchase at no extra expense to you. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you at the library.